The Mystery of Edwin Drood is the final novel by Charles Dickens, originally published in 1870. Though the novel is named after the character Edwin Drood, it focuses more on Drood's uncle, John Jasper, a precentor, choirmaster and opium addict, who is in love with his pupil, Rosa Bud, Miss Bud. Edwin Drood's fiancée has also caught the eye of the high-spirited and hot-tempered Neville Landless, Landless and Edwin Drood take an instant dislike to each other. Later Drood disappears under mysterious circumstances. The story is set in Cloisterham, a lightly disguised Rochester. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. 1. John Jasper. In the quiet town of Cloisterham, in England, in a boarding school, once lived a beautiful girl named Rosa Bud, an amiable, willful, winning, whimsical little creature, whom everyone called Rosebud. She was an orphan. Her mother had been drowned when she was only 7 years old, and her father had died of grief on the first anniversary of that day. Her father's friend and college mate, a Mr. Drood, had comforted his last hours, and they had agreed between them that when Rosebud was old enough she should marry Mr. Drood's son Edwin, then a little boy. Her father put this wish in his will, as did Mr. Drood, who died also soon after his friend, and so Rosebud and Edwin Drood grew up knowing that, though not bound in any way, each was intended for the other. So it came about that, while if they had been let alone they might have fallen in love naturally, yet as it was they were always shy and ill at ease with one another. Yet they liked each other, too. Rosebud's guardian was a Mr. Grugis, an arid, sandy man who looked as if he might be put in a grinding mill and turned out first-class snuff. He had scanty hair, like a yellow fur tippet, and deep notches in his forehead, and was very nearsighted. He seemed to have been born old, so that when he came to London to call on Rosebud amid all the schoolgirls he used to say he felt like a bear with the cramp. Grugis, however, under his oddity had a very tender heart, particularly for Rosebud, whose mother he had been secretly in love with before she married. But he had grown up a dry old bachelor, living in gloomy rooms in London, and no one would have guessed him ever to have been a bit romantic. The school Rosebud attended was called Nun's House. Miss Twinkleton, the prim old maid who managed it, termed it a seminary for young ladies. It had a worn front, with a shining brass stop plate that made it look at a distance like a battered old beau with a big new eyeglass stuck in his blind eye. Here Rosebud lived a happy life, the pet of the whole seminary, till she was a young lady. Cloisterham was a dull, grey town with an ancient cathedral, which was so cold and dark and damp that looking into its door was like looking down the throat of old Father Time. The cathedral had a fine choir, which sang at all the services and was taught and led by a music master whose name was John Jasper. This Jasper, as it happened, was the uncle and guardian of Edwin Drood. Drood, who was studying to be an engineer, was very fond of his uncle and came often to Cloisterham to visit him, so that Rosebud saw a great deal of her intended husband. He always called her Pussy. He used to call on her at the school and take her walking and buy her candy at a Turkish shop called Lumps of Delight, and did his best to get on well with her, though he felt awkward. Drood and Jasper were much more like two friends than like uncle and nephew, for the choirmaster was very little older than the other. Jasper seemed to be wonderfully fond of Drood, and everyone who knew him thought him a most honourable and upright man. But in reality he was far different. At heart he hated the cathedral and the singing, and wished often that he could find relief, like some old monk, in carving demons out of the desks and seats. He had a soul that was without fear or conscience. One vile and wicked practice he had which he had hidden from all who knew him. He was an opium smoker. He would steal away to London to a garret kept by a mumbling old woman who knew the secret of mixing the drug, and there, stretched on a dirty pallet, sometimes with a drunken Chinaman or a lascar beside him, would smoke pipe after pipe of the dreadful mixture that stole away his senses and left him worse than before. Hours later he would awake, give the woman money and hurry back to Cloisterham. Just in time, perhaps, to put on his church robes and lead the cathedral choir. Though no one knew of this, and though Edwin Drood thought his uncle was well-nigh perfect, Rosebud, after she grew up, had no liking for Jasper. He gave her music lessons, and every time they met he terrified her. She felt sometimes that he haunted her thoughts like a dreadful ghost. He seemed almost to make a slave of her with his looks, and she felt that in every glance he was telling her that he, Jasper, loved her and yet compelled her to keep silence. But, though disliking the choirmaster so, and shivering whenever he came near her, Rosebud did not know how to tell Edwin, who she knew loved and believed in Jasper, of her feelings. 2. The coming of Neville Landless. One of the ministers in charge of the cathedral was the Reverend Mr. Crisparkle. A ruddy, young, active, honest fellow, who was perpetually practicing boxing before the looking-glass or pitching himself head foremost into all the streams about the town for a swim, even when it was winter and he had to break the ice with his head. Mr. Crisparkle sometimes took young men into his home to live while he tutored them to prepare them for college. One day he received word from a Mr. Thunder in London, telling him he was about to bring to Cloisterham a twin brother and sister, Neville and Helena Landless. The young man to be taught by Mr. Crisparkle and his sister Helena to be put in Miss Twinkleton's seminary. This Thunder called himself a philanthropist. But he was a queer sort of one, indeed. He was always getting up public meetings and talking loudly, insisting on everybody's thinking exactly as he did, and saying dreadful things of them if they did not. Helena and Neville Landless had been born in Ceylon, where as little children they had been cruelly treated by their stepfather. But they had brave spirits, and 4 times in 6 years they had run away, only to be brought back each time and punished. On each of these occasions, the first had been when they were but 7 years old. Helena had dressed as a boy and once had even tried to cut off her long hair with Neville's pocket knife. At length their cruel stepfather died, and they were sent to England, where for no other reason than that his name was continually appearing in the newspapers, Mr. Thunder had been appointed their guardian. No wonder the brother and sister had grown up thinking everybody was their enemy. They were quite prepared to hate Mr. Crisparkle when their guardian brought them. But by the time Mr. Thunder had gone, and Mr. Crisparkle was as glad as they were when he went home, they liked the young minister and felt that they would be happy there. They were a handsome pair, and Mr. Crisparkle was attracted to them both. Neville was lithe, and dark and rich in colour. Helena was almost like a gypsy, slender, supple and quick. Both seemed half shy, half defiant, as though their blood were untamed. To make them welcome that first evening, Mr. Crisparkle invited to his house Jasper, the choirmaster, with Edwin Drood, who was visiting him, and Rosebud from the seminary. Before they parted, Rosebud was asked to sing. Jasper played her accompaniment, and while she sang he watched her lips intently. All at once, to their great astonishment, Rosebud covered her face with her hands, and, crying out, "I can't bear this. I am frightened. Take me away," burst into tears. Helena, the newcomer, who had liked Rosebud at first sight, seemed to understand her better than anyone else. She laid her on a sofa, soothed her, and in a few moments Rosebud seemed again as usual. Mr. Crisparkle and Edwin Drood thought it only a fit of nervousness. To her relief, they made light of the matter, and so the evening ended. But later, at Non's house, where she and Helena were to be roommates, Rosebud told her new friend how much she disliked Jasper and how his eyes terrified her, and how, as she sang, with his eyes watching her lips, she felt as if he had kissed her. While the two girls were talking of this, Neville and Edwin Drood, who had gone with them as far as the door of the seminary, were walking back together. Mr. Crisparkle had told Neville of Drood's betrothal to Rosa Bud, and Neville now spoke of it. Drood, who had felt all along that he and Rosa Bud did not get along well together and who was sensitive on the subject, was unjustly angry that the other should so soon know what he considered his own private affair. He answered in a surly way and, as both were quick-tempered, they soon came to high words. As it happened, Jasper was walking near, and, overhearing, came between them. He reproved them good-naturedly and took them to his rooms, where he insisted they should drink a glass of wine with him to their good fellowship. There he did a dastardly thing. He mixed with the wine a drug which, once drunk, aroused their angry passions. Their speech grew thick and the quarrel began again, safe now from any spectator. Jasper did not attempt to soothe them. He let them go on until they were about to come to blows. Then, pretending the greatest indignation, he threw himself upon Neville and forced him, hatless, from the house. In the cool night air Neville's strange dizziness, and with it his rage, cleared away. He realized that the blame for the quarrel had been Jasper's, but he did not guess the drugging of the wine and could not explain the incident even to himself. He went, however, manfully and sorrowfully to Mr. Crisparkle and told him what had occurred, and naturally Mr. Crisparkle, who had never found Edwin Drood quarrelsome, thought it the fault of Neville's hot blood and revengeful character. He was the more certain of this when Jasper came to him, bringing Neville's hat, and told him his own story of the meeting. Jasper told him falsely that Neville had made a murderous attack on Drood, and but for him would have laid his nephew dead at his feet. He warned the minister that Neville had a tigerish nature and would yet be guilty of terrible crime. Mr. Crisparkle liked Neville, and all this saddened him, for he had not the least suspicion that Jasper was lying for a cruel purpose of his own. The affair was an unhappy one for Neville. Jasper took care that the story spread abroad. And as it went it grew, so that almost everybody in Cloisterham came to consider Helena's brother a sullen fellow of a furious temper. And they believed it the more because Neville made no secret of the fact that he had fallen in love, too, with Rosa Bud, and in this they thought they saw a reason for his hating Edwin Drood. Mr. Crisparkle was a faithful friend. He concluded soon that the fault was not all on Neville's side. But he was anxious to have the two young men friends, and he begged his pupil for his own part to lay aside the ill feeling. He went to the choirmaster also on the same errand, and Jasper assured him that his nephew would do the same. He even promised, hypocritically, that to bring this about he would invite both Edwin Drood and Neville to dine with him on Christmas Eve, in his own rooms, where they might meet and shake hands. Both young men promised to come to the dinner, and Mr. Crisparkle was highly pleased, little dreaming what the outcome would be. 3. The choirmaster's dinner. There was a quaint character in Cloisterham named Durdles. He was a stone mason whose specialty was the chiseling of tombstones. He was an old bachelor and was both a very skillful workman and a very great sot. He had keys to all the cathedral vaults and was fond of prowling about the old pile and its dismal crypt, for ever tapping, with a little hammer he carried, on its stones and walls, hunting for forgotten cavities, in which, perhaps, centuries before, persons had been buried. He wore a coarse flannel suit with horn buttons and a yellow handkerchief with draggled ends. And it was a daily sight to see him perched on a tombstone eating his dinner out of a bundle. When he was not feeling well he used to say he had a touch of rheumatism, instead of rheumatism. Durdles was drunk so much that he was never certain about getting home at night, so he had hired, at a penny a day, a hideous small boy, known as the deputy, to throw stones at him whenever he found him out of doors after 10 o'clock, and drive him home to his little hole of an unfurnished stone house. The deputy used to watch for Durdles after this hour, and when he saw him he would dance up and sing, "Widdy, widdy, when I catches him out arter 10. Widdy, widdy, why? When he don't Go, then, I shy. Widdy, wake cock warning. It was a part of the bargain that he must give this warning before he began to throw the stones. And when Durdles heard this yell he knew what was coming. Before the Christmas Eve dinner Jasper picked a friendship with Durdles. And, pretending he wanted to make a trip by moonlight with him among the vaults, he persuaded him one night to be his guide. While they were in the crypt of the cathedral Jasper plied him with liquor which he had brought, to such purpose that Durdles went fast asleep and the key of the crypt fell from his hand. He had a dim idea that Jasper picked up the key and went away with it, and was a long time gone, but when he awoke, he could not tell whether this had really happened or not. And this, when the deputy stoned him home that night, was all he could remember of the expedition. But what Jasper had really done while Durdles was asleep, whether he had taken away the key to make a copy of it so as to make one like it for some evil purpose of his own, or whether he wanted to be able to unlock that dark underground place and hide something in it sometime when no one would be with him, this only Jasper himself knew. The Christmas season arrived, and Edwin Drood, according to his promise, came to Cloisterham to his uncle's dinner, at which he was to meet Neville. Before leaving, however, he called upon Mr. Grewgious, Rosa Bud's guardian, who had sent for him with a particular purpose. This purpose was to give into his hands a ring set with diamonds and rubies that had belonged to Rosa Bud's mother. It had been left in trust to Mr. Grewgious to give to the man who married her, that he might himself put it on her finger. And in accordance with the trust, the lawyer charged Drood if anything should be amiss or if anything happened between him and Rosa Bud, to bring back the ring. Mr. Grewgious gave him this keepsake with such wise and friendly advice on the seriousness of marriage that all the way to Cloisterham with the ring in his pocket, Edwin Drood was very thoughtful. He asked himself whether he really loved Rosa Bud as a man should love his wife, whether he had not drifted into this betrothal rather as a result of their parents' wish and wills than from any deeper feeling, and he began to wonder if by marrying her thus he would not be doing her a vast injustice. He decided, therefore, to tell her all that was in his mind and be guided by her judgment. Rosa Bud, meanwhile, in the silence of the Christmas vacation, with only Helena for her companion, had been thinking of the same matter, and her wise little head had reached almost the same conclusion. When Drood came they walked out together under the trees by the cathedral. Their talk was not so difficult after all as each had feared it would be, and both felt relieved when they decided they could be far happier to remain as brother and sister, and not become husband and wife. So they agreed without pain on either side. Drood's only anxiety was for his uncle. He thought Jasper had looked forward to his marriage to Rosa Bud so long that he would be pained and disappointed to learn it was not to be, so he concluded he would not tell him as yet. Poor Rosa Bud. She was greatly agitated. She felt the falseness of Jasper, and knew that he loved her himself, but she realized the impossibility of telling this to the nephew who believed in him. So she was silent. Drood, for his part, since the betrothal was ended, said nothing to her of the ring Grewgious had given to him, intending to return it to the lawyer. They kissed each other when they parted. The wicked choirmaster, who happened to be walking near, saw the embrace and thought it the kiss of lovers soon to be wed. Drood left Rosa Bud then, to pass the time till the hour of the dinner in Jasper's rooms. Neville that day had determined, the dinner over, to start at dawn next morning on a walking tour, to be absent a fortnight. He bought a knapsack and a heavy steel shod stick in preparation for this expedition, and bade his sister Helena and Mr. Crisparkle goodbye before he went to the appointed meeting at the choirmaster's. Jasper himself, it was noticed, had never seemed in better spirits than on that day, nor had he ever sung more sweetly than in the afternoon service before the dinner, which he gave to the two young men. If he was contemplating a terrible crime, no one would have guessed it from his serene face and his agreeable manner. Edwin Drood had one warning just before he went up the postern stair that led to his uncle Jasper's, the old hag who mixed the opium in the London garret weather. choirmaster smoked the drug, had more than once tried to find out who her strange, gentlemanly visitor was. She had listened to his mutterings in his drunken slumber. And at length that day had followed him from London to Cloisterham, only to lose track of him there. As Drood strolled, waiting for the dinner hour to strike from the cathedral chimes, he passed her and she begged money from him. He gave it to her and she asked him his name and whether he had a sweetheart. He answered Edwin, and that he had none. "Be thankful your name's not Ned," she said. "For it's a bad name and a threatened name." Ned was the name Jasper always called him by, but Drood did not think seriously of the old woman's words. He could not have guessed that the threats she spoke of against the Ned who had a sweetheart had been murmured in his drugged slumber by his own uncle against himself. And yet something at just that moment made him shudder. So the chimes struck, and Edwin Drood went on to Jasper's rooms to meet his uncle, and Neville Landless went to his doom. For from that time no one who loved him ever saw him again in this world. 4. Jasper shows his teeth. That night a fearful tempest howled over Cloisterham. In the morning early, as the storm was breaking, Jasper, the choirmaster, came pale, panting and half-dressed to Mr. Crisparkle's, asking for Edwin Drood. He said his nephew had left his rooms the evening before with Neville Landless to go to the river to look at the storm, and had not returned. Strange rumours sprang up at once. Neville had left for his walking tour, and an ugly suspicion flew from house to house. He had got only a few miles from the town when he was overtaken by a party of men, who surrounded him, thinking at first that they were thieves. He fought them, but was soon rendered helpless and bleeding, and in the midst of them was taken back toward Cloisterham. Mr. Crisparkle and Jasper met them on the way, and from the former Neville first learned of what he was suspected. The blood from his encounter with his captors was on his clothes and stick. Jasper pointed it out, and even those who had seen it fall there looked darkly at the stains. He was taken back to the town and to Mr. Crisparkle's house, who promised that he should remain in his own custody. Neville's story was simple. He said they had gone to the river, as Jasper had said, and returned together, he to Mr. Crisparkle's, Edwin Drood to his uncle's. He had not seen the others since that time. The river was dragged and its banks searched, but to no purpose, till Mr. Crisparkle himself found Drood's watch caught among some timbers in a weir. But as the body could not be found, it could not be definitely proven that Drood was dead, or that any murder had been committed, so at last Neville was released. The whole neighbourhood, however, believed him guilty of the murder. No one spoke to him and he was obliged to quit the place. Beside his sister Helena and Rosa Bud, who, of course, believed in his innocence, he had but one friend there, Mr. Crisparkle. The latter stoutly refused to believe him guilty. When Neville left for London, through Mr. Grewgious, Rosebud's guardian, the minister found him a cheap lodging and made frequent trips to the city to help and advise him in his studies. Mr. Grewgious had his own opinion of the affair. One day he went to Cloisterham to see Jasper, and there told him a thing the other did not yet know, that before that last night Edwin Drood and Rosebud had agreed not to marry. When he heard this the choirmaster's face turned the colour of lead. He shrieked and fell senseless at the lawyer's feet. Mr. Grewgious went back to the city more thoughtful than ever, and it was not long before a detective came from London to Cloisterham and began to interest himself in all the doings of John Jasper. The detective, to be sure, was not known as such. He called himself Dick Datchery and gave it out that he was an idle dog who lived on his money and had nothing to do. He was a curious-looking man, with a great shock of white hair, black eyebrows and a military air. He rented lodgings next door to the choirmaster, and before long had made friends with Durdles, the tombstone maker, and even with the deputy of the Wake-Cock Warning. Meanwhile Jasper, haggard and red-eyed, took again his place in the cathedral choir. while Neville Landless worked sadly and alone in his London garret. The latter made but one friend in this time, a lodger whose window adjoined his own. This lodger was Lieutenant Tartar, a retired young naval officer. Tartar might have lived in fine apartments, for he was rich. But he had been so long on shipboard that he felt more at home where the walls were low enough for him to knock his head on the ceiling. He used to climb across to Neville's room by the window ledges. And they became friendly, the warmer friends when Mr. Crisparkle discovered in the lieutenant a schoolmate who had once saved his life. Later, too, Helena left Miss Twinkleton's seminary and came to be with her brother. And so a year went by. Vacation arrived, and one day when Rosa Bud was alone at Nun's house, Jasper, for the first time since Edwin Drood's disappearance, came to see her. He found her in the garden, and she felt again the repulsion and fear she had always felt at sight of him. This time the choirmaster threw away all concealment. He told her that he had always loved her hopelessly and madly, though while she was betrothed to his nephew he had hidden the fact. She answered indignantly that, by look, if not by word, he had always been false to Edwin Drood. That he had made her life unhappy by his pursuit of her, and that, though she had shrunk from opening his nephew's eyes, she had always known he was a wicked man. Then, maddened by her dislike, Jasper swore that no one else should ever marry her, that he would pursue her to the death, and that if she repulsed him he would bring dreadful ruin upon Neville Landless. He said this, no doubt, knowing that Neville loved Rosa Bud, and thinking, perhaps, that she loved him in return. When Jasper left her, Rosa Bud was faint from fear of his wicked eyes. She made up her mind to go at once for protection to Mr. Grewgious in London, and, leaving a note for Miss Twinkleton, she left by the next omnibus. She told her guardian her story. He told it to Mr. Crisparkle, who came to London next morning, and between them they told Lieutenant Tartar. While Rosa Bud visited with Helena, the three men took counsel together, agreeing that Jasper was a villain and planning how best to deal with him. The next time the choirmaster visited the opium garret the old woman tracked him back to Cloisterham. With more success, with such success, indeed, that she heard him sing in the cathedral and found out his name from a stranger whom she encountered. This stranger was Dick Datchery, the detective, who discovered so much, before he left her, of Jasper's London habits that he went home in high good humour. Datchery had a trick, whenever he was following a particular search, of marking each step of his progress by a chalk mark on a wall or door. Today he must have been highly pleased, for he drew a thick line from the very top of the cupboard door to the bottom. When Charles Dickens, the master storyteller, had told this tale thus far, he fell ill and died, and it was never finished. The mystery of the disappearance of Edwin Drood, what became of Rosa Bud and of Mr. Crisparkle, how Neville and Helena fared and what was the end of Jasper, are matters for each one of us to guess. Many have tried to finish this story and they have ended it in various ways. Before Dickens died, however, he told to a friend the part of the story that remained unwritten, and this, the friend has recorded, was to be as follows. By means of the old woman of the opium den, Durdles, the tombstone maker, and the deputy, the ragged stone thrower, Dick Datchery unravelled the threads which finally made into a net, caught Jasper, the murderer, in its meshes. Little by little, word by word, he was made at last to betray himself. He had killed Edwin Drood, had hidden his body in one of the vaults and covered it with lime. But there had been one thing in the dead man's pocket which the lime could not destroy. This was the ring set with diamonds and rubies, that had been given to him by Mr. Grewgious. By this the murder was proven. Mr. Crisparkle and Mr. Grewgious worked hard to clear Neville Landless, of whose guilt, by the way, Mr. Honeythund remained always sure. But poor Neville himself perished in aiding Lieutenant Tartar to seize the murderer. Finding all hope of escape gone, Jasper confessed his crime in the cell in which he waited for death. But, after all, The story closed happily, with the marriage of Mr. Crisparkle to Neville's sister Helena, and that of Lieutenant Tartar to pretty little Rosebud. End of the story. Thank you.